When we talk about salvation, what do we mean? Join me as we gain a new perspective on salvation. Several months ago, as I was reading through Genesis 1, 2, and 3, I began to see some repetitions that I had never seen before. And as a result, I came away with a new perspective on salvation. If you'll hang with me over the next 8 weeks, we'll take a look at a new perspective on the temptation, a new perspective on the fall of man, a new perspective on the curse that man received, and then a new perspective on the solution that God gives us in Jesus. In Genesis chapter 1, the first repetition that I saw was one that I had actually seen before. 7 times in Genesis chapter 1, it says that God looked at his creation. He looked at what he had done, and he saw that it was good. That occurs in verse 4, 10, 12, 18, 21, and 25, the first 6 ones. For example, in verse 21, God created great sea creatures and every living thing that scurries and swarms in the water, and every sort of bird, each producing offspring of the same kind. God saw that it was good. Now on the 6th day of creation, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, God looked over everything that he had made, and he saw that it was very good. Now this concept of good is carried over into chapter 2. Chapter 2 presents a different perspective on the creation. Chapter 1 is more historical in basis, the process in which God created things. Chapter 2 is more existential. It has to do with the purpose of creation. God ultimately wanted to create mankind, and in doing that, he needed a place for man to live. And so he created a garden that man could be in. And the garden had trees in it. Those trees were pleasing to see and good to eat. That comes in chapter 2, verse 9. And one tree in particular was the knowledge of good and evil. Now, man was not to eat of that tree. Man understood what good was. He could look around him and see all the good that God had made. But he didn't yet understand what evil was. This comes out later in chapter 3 in the narrative of the temptation. But in chapter 2, verse 18, for the first time, God identifies something as not good. In chapter 2:18, it is not good for man to be alone. I'll make a helper who is just right for him. Now, immediately, God brings all of the animals in front of Adam, and he asks Adam to name them. Was God out of his creative juices? Well, I don't think so. God easily could have named the animals. But his purpose in bringing the animals for Adam, we find in chapter 2, verse 20. Adam gave names to all the livestock, all the birds of the sky, all the wild animals. And there was still no helper just right for him. The whole purpose of God in bringing the animals for Adam was so that Adam would realize that in the animal kingdom, there was no helper that was just right for him. Now, in looking at the word helper, the thing that I noticed, the word helper occurs only 14 times in the Old Testament. 10 of those refer to God. Now that's interesting. The helper that God was going to give to Adam was, at least in some ways, similar to God himself. The other is the phrase suitable for him. Literally, the word that's used simply means standing before him, a helper who would stand before him. Now, there is no subservience involved here. In fact, in the many times that this phrase, suitable for him, occurs, the vast majority of the times that it occurs, it refers to someone who is actually stronger than the one that he's helping. God causes Adam to sleep, and he creates out of a rib that he's taken from Adam a woman. When Adam wakes from his sleep, he sees the woman and he says, well, of course this is it. Eve is a helper suitable for me. In essence, what God was doing, God was saying, I am not always with you, Adam. Let me create someone who can be my substitute when I'm not here. Let me create someone who is in my place when I'm not here. In the same manner, Adam was to be that helper for Eve. Now, in chapter 3, the serpent was craftier than every other animal. And the serpent came to Eve actually, and said, has God said that you shouldn't eat from any of the trees of the garden? And Eve said, oh, no. We can eat of all of the trees except that one. That one is called the tree of good and evil. And we can't eat from that tree. We can't even touch it or we'll die. Now, the serpent said, Eve, God has created you to be a helper for Adam. Yes, that's right. Don't you want to be a good helper? Yes, I do. What the serpent tells Eve is that if you eat from that tree, you will become more like God, more of a helper to Adam than you have been in the past. Eat the tree, and you'll understand good and evil, and you'll become like God. Isn't that what you're supposed to do? And Eve ultimately said, why, yes, it is. And she looked at the tree. She saw that the tree was pleasing. Now, this comes straight from chapter 2, verse 9. All of the trees of the garden were pleasing to look at and good to eat. Eve looked at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and she saw that it was pleasing. The interesting thing about the word pleasing, that word occurs some 21 times in the Old Testament. 6 times it's translated as pleasing. The vast majority of those times are here in chapter 2 and chapter 3. But the rest of the times, 14 times, it's translated lust, covet. Pleasing has gone beyond simply pleasure, and it's become a desire, a coveting, a lust. This is the word that Moses used in, I believe it's the 7th commandment, thou shalt not covet. It's this very same word. The tree was pleasing. This gave me a new perspective on what temptation actually is. I had tended to think of temptation as the temptation to do things that were horrible, do things that were contrary to God's will. But what the serpent actually tempts Eve to do is a very natural thing. Look at the fruit, Eve. You'll find that it's pleasing, just like all of the other trees. Take the fruit, Eve, and you'll become more like God, just what God wants you to be. Temptation takes normal things, good things and turns them into lust. Do you remember the list of the mortal sins that's presented in many Catholic churches, but we can learn so much from it? The sin of pride is the first. What is pride? It is simply a desire for honor. Now, the desire for honor is natural and good. We're actually told to be honorable. We're even told to seek honor. But pride turns that desire for a good thing to a lust. The lust for honor is pride. Greed. Possessing things is not evil. Possessing things is a necessary part of life. But the lust for possession becomes greed. Pleasure is a good thing. The trees of the garden were pleasant to look at. There was pleasure there, but the lust for pleasure becomes hedonism. Envy. Self-advancement is good. God wants us to grow, but the lust for self-advancement, the lust when we look at what another has and says we need that too, that becomes sin. Gluttony is the fifth mortal sin. Now, eating is good. Eating brings pleasure. How many times did Jesus sit down to eat with his disciples and those who were following him? But the lust for eating, the addiction to eating becomes gluttony, wrath. Anger in and of itself is not a negative thing. Anger is an appropriate response to sin when we see it. But the lust for my own way, the explosions of anger becomes wrath. Finally, sloth. God calls us to rest. He gives us one day a week in which he wants us to rest. But the lust for rest is sloth. Each one of the mortal sins starts with something good, but the enemy turns that on its head. He makes it something completely inappropriate. In the New Testament, in the book of 1 John, chapter 2:16, Paul talks about this in a slightly different way. He says, everything that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. The lust of the flesh, the passions that can overtake us. The lust of the eyes, possessions, and the desire to constantly own more and more. The pride of life, position. The desire to be number one, especially when it means that I have to step on you to get there. Passions, possession, position. All of these things, John says, comes not from the Father, but from the world. Temptation is real today, but temptation frequently comes not to do crazy things, but to do perfectly normal things, taken to a crazy degree. Pleasure becomes envy, lust, coveting. Let's take back temptation, give it to the Lord, and ask him to help us to find appropriate measures in our own life of what we need to be doing. I hope you enjoyed a new perspective on temptation. Next time, we'll talk about a new perspective on the fall of man.